Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Now we would like to welcome our next speaker, Mr. Mohammed Nanabai, Deputy CEO of Media Development Investments Fund. Please welcome Mr. Mohammed Nanabai.
Thank you. Just give me a second to pull up this presentation. Great. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
It's good to be back at Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera alum. It's probably been about 5 or 6 years since I was with Al Jazeera. And one of the things when I was here back in the mid to late 2000s, we used to have a lot of former BBC people at Al Jazeera. And I remember a conversation with Adrian Monk, who's one of the executives of the World Economic Forum. And I said, we've got all these former BBC people, and they keep on saying to us, when I was at the BBC, we did this and this and this. And he joked, because Al Jazeera was sort of on this upward trajectory at the time, and he said, don't worry, there'll be a day when you guys sit and say, when I was at Al Jazeera, we did this and this and this. And I think that's come to pass, and I find myself saying that and always chuckling at that. So what I wanted to talk about today is a bit about social media and how that's been changing the news industry. And what the impact's been on us as content creators and us as journalists, because I think there's been some fundamental shifts. And we're at a point now where everybody accepts that social and social technologies and the platforms and everything that's come along with mobile has fundamentally altered the way we deal with media and the way we understand our audiences, the way we interact with them. So I thought it's a good moment to take a step back and to look at this and really try to understand what the shift has meant for us, because the shift has happened so rapidly. It's really a matter of 20 years that everything's changed in our industry. So, I'm sure everybody recognizes this picture. This picture was taken in 1963 in Vietnam, in Saigon. And it's a Pulitzer Prize winning picture from Malcolm Brown, an AP photographer. And when this picture was taken, what had happened was Vietnamese monks, Buddhist monks, were protesting at the time. And they had gone out and they'd gone to the foreign press in Saigon and said, tomorrow there'll be something taking place. Please come. And most foreign correspondents at the time didn't bother. Malcolm Brown and 1 or 2 others went through. And this monk, and you can see in the background, there were many other monks around him, sat himself down very calmly and set himself on fire. And this picture was then taken, Malcolm Brown, it was on the AP, through the wires, was distributed around the world, showed up in newspapers, in the press, on television around the world, and really became iconic. And what we saw here was something that's sort of fundamental to the way press coverage happens, right? Somebody creates a spectacle, and this spectacle is then covered by us, the content creators, the editors, the news people, and then we disseminate it to the audience. And if you look at the time this took, from the photograph being taken, it being distributed on the AP wire, being sent around the world, getting printed, put into newspapers, there was a time gap that happened, but also it was clear, there was somebody who was the news media who produced, and it was then distributed, and audiences consumed, and that had an effect. Now if you fast forward to 2011, and this is Cairo, and these are the iconic scenes of Tahrir Square. And this was really 18 days of protest that happened. So we went from this idea of the spectacle that occurred, that the press would cover, to end up here, where it was a spectacular, that was 24-hour rolling coverage that wasn't just us as the news broadcasting out, but it was really co-created, right? It was on social media, there were the protesters, the audience were all participants in this. The viewers at home who were watching this live, seeing it unfold on Twitter, on Facebook, through live streams, were all part of this. And it was ongoing, it was 24/7. And this fundamentally alters. And if you look at the story of moving from a photograph that gets taken and distributed over days to something that's then broadcast simultaneously around the world, being followed, being experienced by people everywhere. It's mind-blowing to think that in the amount of time, just years that we've got to this. But what's really interesting about this and how we got here was not that we were doing this coverage 24/7, but it was how it started. And it really goes back to this video on YouTube. This was one of the first videos that went online on the 25th of January in Egypt of that year. And you can see it ended up getting 3 million views. And this is not today where you get 100 million views before you eat your cornflakes in the morning, right? This was still 2011. 3 million views was a huge number of video views. But this coverage came out before everybody else, before the news media descended on Cairo to start this coverage. So it was initiated by a person who was sitting up in their flat in their apartment, who took this video. People saw it first. The media then reacted and then covered this, and a cycle occurred where, as the media descended, protests increased. As protests increased, more people in the crowd took videos. Those then went online. The media then broadcast this. And this cycle continued for those 18 days. And it's really important to look at, there wasn't somebody who went to the press and said, please, we're having this, something's happening tomorrow that's really important in Saigon, come and cover it. Where this occurred, somebody covered it themselves from the audience, who was a bystander, and kicked off a series of events. So I want to unpack the shift that's happened over time. So, this was where we hear, what I like to call back in the old days, when Liverpool still reigned supreme in English football. Late 80s, early 90s. And this was how we dealt with our audience. We were the news media, we created, we produced, and our audience consumed. And that relationship was clear. It was easy for us to understand. But also, it had an effect on the business model, it had an effect on our distribution, it affected everything that we did, right? So if you think about it, our newspaper audiences were subscribers. We knew who they were, we sent them a newspaper. Our people who watched our broadcasts subscribed, knew our channels, they knew what number we were. We were channel 37 on the remote control, or channel 5. And they'd tune in at 7 p.m. and watch us. It was easy, it was great for us. And then the internet came along, and things got a bit hazy, right? And the road became a bit more windy. And in the late 90s, as we all started going online, suddenly, people had this choice, right? They could go and look at a news website from anywhere in the world. But we still maintained this connection, right? Because when we went online in the 90s, we kind of still went to the newspaper that we knew. We just went to their website. We still knew them. Remember bookmarks, right? You had a bookmark bar, and you drop down and you click on the website you wanted to go and see. And usually it was your hometown newspaper or your local TV station. So things got a bit more complicated, but we still had that audience. They still knew us. They would come and find us. We'd advertise our website somehow. We'd print them out, and people would come and they'd find us. And in the 2000s, something radical started to happen, because this is when publishing technologies became democratized. And people were able to publish themselves with a click of a button. So these were the early days of Blogger and other social platforms, right? So people would be able to come online, they'd be able to publish something quickly. And that started fundamentally altering the publishing landscape, because it was no longer just us, there were other people publishing. And now we were sort of not necessarily competing, but there were other voices being there. And what we then started thinking about as an industry was, well, it's not us talking to them anymore. That was those days are gone. Things are changing now. People are beginning to publish. They're starting to put videos onto YouTube. Social technologies were taking off. So we thought, we'll sit in the middle of all of this. We'd hear what those bloggers say. We'd incorporate some of that into our stories. There was hope, right? Because we thought, well, actually now, while in the past we didn't know what our audience was thinking, now we could hear them. We could go online, we could see what our audience was writing, what stories they were reacting to. We could incorporate that. It was a cycle, and things were still good for us. But fast forward, to this decade, and everything became much more messy. And the reason is, as Yasser mentioned, the business models for many of those social media companies, came to rely on advertising revenue. That advertising, they gobbled up the ad market, they grew it, and they became intermediaries in the truest sense. So while in the 2000s, we still had this open ecosystem. You had distributed blogging systems that existed. Some people would be on Blogger, some people would be on Vox, some people would be on TypePad, some people had their own WordPress blogs, and stuff was all over the place. But in this last decade, everything's converged into a handful of companies: Facebook, Twitter, Google, Snapchat, right? And those are the big platforms. And we see others. So if you're in Asia, there's Line and QQ and Tencent. But, by and large, there's really a handful of companies that are now controlling distribution. No one's got a bookmark bar anymore. No one clicks and says, okay, I'm going back to this website because I've saved it in my bookmark anymore. And it's put us in the position where we were suddenly central to a conversation, to where we're back on the side and we're trying to find a way to reach our audience. So we're looking at how do we do social distribution strategies, right? Because our audience is here, but they're not connected to us anymore. We don't have that direct relationship that we had in the past. And that's really one of the huge shifts that happened. But in addition, what's also happened is the same people who would make the news, who we'd go to cover, now has direct access to our former audiences themselves, right? So Trump can tweet directly without worrying about, going to the New York Times, right? He has direct access to his audience. And that's been a massive shift as well. So in a way now, we've become completely reactive, right? We're covering what he's saying to our audience back again, instead of us being the ones conveying that information. And one of the things that we've come to accept is it's never going back, right? This is the world we live in now, and it's only going to get more complicated and more interconnected and more dynamic. So this is the journey. This is where we ended up. So what does it mean for us? So I think there's a couple of things which I think are worth talking about, and for us to understand sort of almost philosophically, so then we look at how do we design strategies to deal with them as media companies moving forward. So first of all, this disintermediation happened, right? We used to have the direct link. It's gone. So how do we deal with that? And I think that's important for us to figure that out. But meanwhile, something super interesting happened as well. While we were disintermediated from our audiences, at the same time, we were able to engage them, which is something we couldn't do as well. And it's almost paradoxical that this has occurred, right? The link was cut, but it actually grew stronger in a way. So if you were able to figure out how do you engage with people across these platforms, even though they put themselves in between, you could still do really interesting things, and you could hear interesting voices. So I think that's the first effect. The second was the instantaneity of it. So things were happening now, happen at such speed that we were unable to comprehend. In a way, the broadcast industry is, sort of the best suited to deal with this, because the broadcast industry has always been working at speed, right? So if you're a broadcaster, and especially a 24/7 broadcaster, news is always rolling in, and you're always looking at that latest coverage. But people in the print media and other forms of media, this really hit them. Because suddenly, you've been running a newsroom that's on a daily publishing schedule or a weekly publishing schedule, and suddenly you're expected to do not just daily news, but not just hourly news, but always on minute-by-minute coverage on Twitter, right? Which you're not geared up for. It was never part of your DNA. So, that really put people on the back foot, and everybody scrambled to get these teams to figure out. And there were different types of reporters, right? If you were a long-form reporter, a beat reporter, now suddenly you're expected to tweet and to do all these sorts of things really quickly. But at the same time, that created opportunities, right? For people who are nimble, people who could adapt to these platforms, people who could adapt to that speed, and who could figure out how do we do the long form, the in-depth stories, and make them work on these platforms, they were presented with these opportunities to suddenly grow audiences. So while in the past, we were big brands, we had an audience, people knew us, we could see new players emerge now. Because suddenly, through the speed, through the scale, they could quickly reach audiences as well. And we didn't have that monopoly on them. The third effect of this was something that we were all really hopeful for in the 2000s, right? This was the time of the open internet. Everybody had a voice. You could go online and you could publish, right? And so it was a time when there were, many ideas, it was really almost momentous for us. And what happened, so while we've had that, and we've had all these voices come online that previously might have been marginalized, might not have had access, suddenly could go and they could publish. But at the same time, we've also seen the rise of censorship, right? Both by governments, but as well, if we go back to that image, by those corporations, right? Because they now, stand in the way, and they have the power to take something offline, to block something, and so on. So not only are we dealing with government censorship, but often we're dealing with platform censorship, and we're trying to figure out what that means. And especially when we have these consolidated systems, it becomes a real issue, and something we still need to solve for. And the fourth issue is really this idea of scale, right? We could reach scale, and you can very quickly reach scale, right? You could reach thousands, millions of people very quickly. Things were distributed, things could go viral. But at the same time, while we saw the scale happen, and we thought, well, now we can reach people who wouldn't otherwise have been interested in our perspective, we started seeing, and especially in the last 2 years, the issue of trust come up, right? Where on the one hand, we could reach lots of people, but on the other hand, there's so much misinformation on the network, and people trying to exploit both the scale, but as well as the fact that those same intermediaries now could allow anybody to publish, and on these platforms, people often were unable to differentiate between what's true, what's not, what's misinformation, what's propaganda. So scale was great, but it also brought us trust issues. And that's one of the most burning issues that we face as an industry, both on the media side as well on the technology, internet platform side. And finally, this issue of open and closed networks. And I think this is quite fundamental for us because, previously we really thought when things were open, it was better for everybody because it meant we could root around censorship, we could root around all these sort of things. And when things close up, it becomes difficult. But it also means on the business model side that there's a few companies who now have control. We have control of the ad inventory, have control of distribution, and they can throttle you and really just close down a media organization if you fall afoul. In the same way, governments might have had that power in the past. Now we see corporations pick up that power. Now, we're not sure yet whether it will be misused, but those risks exist. So, finally, I think it would be a mistake to really see all of these issues as technology issues, because they're not technology issues. Technology has caused it, right? The rise of the internet, the rise of this globally distributed system has brought these challenges to us. But, these are business problems, they're editorial problems, they're product problems, and they're culture problems. And as much as they're problems, they're opportunities for us. They're opportunities for us to explore, to grow our audiences, to reach new people, and to innovate, and to build really interesting products that can suit our audience, suit the people we're meant to serve. Thank you.